It speaks more eloquently than any one person can of the strength and the spirit of British statesmanship and British democracy. Margaret Thatcher was a remarkable type of leader. She said very clearly, "I am not a consensus politician, but a conviction politician." She could sum up those convictions, linked profoundly with her upbringing and values, in just a few short phrases. Sound money, strong defence, liberty under the rule of law. You shouldn't spend what you haven't earned. Governments don't create wealth, businesses do that. The clarity of these convictions was applied with great courage to the problems of the age. And the scale of her achievements is only apparent when you look back to Britain in the 1970s. Successive governments had failed to deal with what was beginning to be called the British disease. Appalling industrial relations, poor productivity, persistently high inflation. Though it seems absurd today, the state had got so big that it owned our airports and airline, the phones in our houses, trucks on our roads. The state even owned a removal company. The air was thick with defeatism. There was a sense that the role of government was simply to manage decline. Margaret Thatcher rejected this defeatism. She had a clear view about what needed to change. Inflation was to be controlled, not by incomes policies, but by monetary and fiscal discipline. Industries were to be set free into the private sector. Trade unions should be handed back to their members. People should be able to buy their own council homes. Success in these endeavours was never assured. Her political story was one of a perpetual battle in the country, in this place, and sometimes even in her own cabinet too. Of course, her career could have taken an entirely different path. In the late 1940s, before she entered politics, the then Margaret Roberts went for a job at ICI. The personnel department rejected her application and afterwards wrote this: "This woman is headstrong, obstinate and dangerously self-opinionated." Mr. Speaker, even her closest friends would agree she could be all of those things. But the point is this: she used that conviction and that resolve in the service of our country, and we are all the better for that. Mr. Speaker, Margaret Thatcher was also a great parliamentarian. She loved and respected this place and was for many years its finest debater. She was utterly fastidious in her preparations. I was a junior party researcher in the 1980s, and the trauma of preparation for Prime Minister's questions is still seared into my memory. Twice a week, it was as if the arms of a giant octopus shook every building in Whitehall for every analysis of every problem, every answer to every question. And her respect for Parliament was instilled into others. Early in her first government, a junior minister was seen running through the lobby. His hair was dishevelled, and he was carrying both a heavy box and a full tray of papers on his arm. Another member cried out, "Slow down, Rome wasn't built in a day." To which the minister replied, "Yes, but Margaret Thatcher wasn't the foreman on that job." As Tony Blair, rightly in my view, said this week, Margaret Thatcher was one of the very few leaders who changed not only the political landscape in their own country, but in the rest of the world too. She was no starry-eyed internationalist, but again her approach was rooted in some simple and clear principles. Strength abroad begins with strength at home. Deterrence, not appeasement. The importance of national sovereignty, which is why she fought so passionately for Britain's interests in Europe and always believed that Britain should keep its own currency. Above all, she believed to the core of her being that Britain stood for something in the world, for democracy, for the rule of law, for right over might. She loathed communism and believed in the invincible power of the human spirit to resist and ultimately defeat tyranny. She never forgot that Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, these were great European cities, capitals of free nations, temporarily trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Today, in different corners of the world, there are millions of people who know that they owe their freedom, in part, to Margaret Thatcher. In Kuwait, which she helped free from Saddam's jackboot, across Eastern and Central Europe, and of course, in the Falkland Islands. In a week from now, as people gather in London to lay Margaret Thatcher to rest, the sun will be rising over the Falklands. And because of her courage, and because of the skill and bravery and sacrifice of our armed forces, it will rise again for freedom. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about the battles that Margaret Thatcher fought. She certainly did not shy from the fight, and that led to arguments, to conflict, yes, even to division. But what is remarkable, looking back now, is how many of those arguments are no longer arguments at all. No one wants to return to strikes without a ballot. No one believes that large industrial companies should be owned by the state. The nuclear deterrent, NATO, the special relationship, these are widely accepted as the cornerstones of our security and defence policies. We argue, sometimes very passionately, in this House about tax, but none of us is arguing for a return to tax rates of 98%. So many of the principles that Lady Thatcher fought for are now part of the accepted political landscape of our country. As Winston Churchill once put it, there are some politicians who make the weather, and Margaret Thatcher was undoubtedly one of them. Mr. Speaker, in the members' lobby of the House of Commons, there are rightly 4 principal statues. Lloyd George, who gave us the beginnings of the welfare state; Winston Churchill, who gave us victory in war; Clement Attlee, who gave us the NHS; and Margaret Thatcher, who rescued our country from post-war decline. They say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Well, in 1979, came the hour and came the lady. She made the political weather, she made history, and let this be her epitaph, that she made our country great again. And I commend this motion to the House.
Order. The question is that this House has considered the matter of tributes to the Right Honourable the Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven LG OM. Mr. Edward Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I want to join the Prime Minister in commemorating the extraordinary life and unique contribution of Margaret Thatcher. And I want to join him in sending my deepest condolences to her children, Carol and Mark, the whole family, and her many, many close friends. Today is an opportunity for us to reflect on Margaret Thatcher's personal achievements, her style of politics, and her political legacy. And as the Prime Minister said, the journey from being the child of a grocer to Downing Street is an unlikely one. And it is particularly remarkable because she was the daughter, not the son, of a grocer. At each stage of her life, she broke the mould. A woman at Oxford when there was not a single woman in the university who held a full professorship. A woman chemist when most people assumed scientists had to be men. A woman candidate for Parliament in 1950 against the opposition of some in her local party in Dartford at the age of only 24. A woman MP in 1959 when just 4% of MPs in the whole of this House were women. The only woman in the cabinet when she was appointed in 1970, and of course, the first woman Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it is no wonder she remarked as early as 1965 in a speech to the National Union of Town Women's Guilds Conference, in politics, if you want anything said, ask a man. If you want anything done, ask a woman. I'm sure some people in this House, I was going to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure some people in this House, and no doubt many more in the country, will agree with this sentiment. Having broken so many conventions as a woman, it can't be a coincidence that she was someone who in so many other areas of life was willing to take on the established orthodoxies. Margaret Thatcher's ability to overcome every obstacle in her path is just one measure of her personal strength. And that takes me to her style of politics. You can disagree with Margaret Thatcher, but it is important to understand the kind of political leader she was. What was unusual was that she sought to be rooted in people's daily lives, but she also believed that ideology mattered. Not for her the contempt sometimes heaped on ideas and new thinking in political life. And while she never would have claimed to be or wanted to be seen as an intellectual, she believed and she showed that ideas matter in politics. In 1945, Mr. Speaker, before the end of the war, she bought a copy of Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. There is even a story that she suggested that Conservative Central Office distribute it in the 1945 general election campaign. She said it left a permanent mark on my political character. And nobody can grasp Margaret Thatcher's achievements and Thatcherism without also appreciating the ideas that were its foundation, and the way in which they departed from the prevailing consensus of the time. In typical homespun style, on breakfast TV, she said this in 1995: "Consensus doesn't give you any direction. It is like mixing all the constituent ingredients together and not coming out with a cake. Democracy is about the people being given a choice." It was that approach that enabled her to define the politics of a whole generation and influence the politics of generations to come. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I all came of age in the 1980s, when you defined your politics by being for or against what she was doing. It's fair to say we took different paths. 30 years on, the people of Britain still argue about her legacy. She was right to understand the sense of aspiration of people across the country. She was right to recognise our economy needed to change. She said in 1982 how absurd it will seem in a few years' time that the state ran Pickford's removals and the Gleneagles Hotel. She was right. And in foreign policy, she was right to defend the Falklands and bravely reach out to new leadership in the Soviet Union. And something often forgotten, Mr. Speaker, she was the first political leader in any major country to warn of the dangers of climate change, long before anyone thought of hugging a husky. But it would be dishonest. But it would be dishonest and not in keeping with the principles that Margaret Thatcher stood for, even on this day, not to be open with this House about the strong opinions and the deep divisions there were and are over what she did. In mining areas like the one I represent, communities felt angry and abandoned. Gay and lesbian people felt stigmatised by measures like Section 28, which today's Conservative Party has rightly repudiated. And it was no accident that when he became leader of the Conservative Party, the Right Honourable Member for Chingford wrote a pamphlet called "There Is Such a Thing as Society." And on the world stage, as this Prime Minister rightly said in 2006 when he was leader of the opposition, she made the wrong judgment about Nelson Mandela and about sanctions in South Africa. Mr. Speaker, debates about her and what she represented will continue for many years to come. This is a mark of her significance as a political leader, someone with deep convictions, willing to act on them. As she put it, politics is more when you have convictions than a matter of multiple manoeuvrings to get you through the problems of the day. And as a person, nothing became her so much as the manner of her final years. The loss of her beloved husband, Dennis, and her struggle with illness. She bore both with the utmost dignity and courage. The same courage she showed decades earlier after the atrocity of the Brighton bombing. And Mr. Speaker, I will always remember seeing her at the cenotaph, in frail health, but determined to pay her respects to our troops and do her duty by the country. Whatever your view of her, Margaret Thatcher was a unique and towering figure. I disagree with much of what she did, but I respect what her death means to the many, many people who admired her, and I honour her personal achievements. On previous occasions, we've come to this House to remember the extraordinary Prime Ministers who have served our nation. Today we also remember a Prime Minister who defined her age. Yeah.